We are back at it. This is Mr. Cummings. It is chapter 28, looking at 1960s of our journey through AP US history. So let's get it, let's go. All right, so here we have two different takes on the iconic I Want You poster. On the left, we have the traditional one we're probably more familiar with, World War I, World War II, early 20th century time period. And on the right, we have Uncle Sam saying, I want out, reaching with a beseeching hand for help. The one on the right clearly is in reference to Vietnam. That is in this chapter. That's always a clue. So, question at the bottom is who would have supported the image on the right? So, who would have supported an anti-Vietnam message? Take a second, pause the video, come up with the answer yourself. And when you join back with us, we'll find out that it would be the hippies, the students, the civil rights movement in large part would have protested Vietnam and agreed with the image on the right. Who would have opposed it? The older generation, the more conservative side, and the Republican Party guys like that would have been more against that image, country first, typical. Kennedy, he got elected in 1960, very close election. Television played a prominent role against Vice President Nixon, and he's pretty good early on. Gets Congress to do what he wants. Isn't a huge liberal guy, isn't really far out there on the left by the standards of today. Doesn't really depart from Eisenhower's policies, doesn't want to increase the budget, promotes tax cuts. He will increase spending on defense. Why? Because it's the Cold War. As well as NASA. Remember, Kennedy was the one who said, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. With everything else that Kennedy wants to do is not going to be as successful. Kennedy's programs are called the New Frontier. Remember, Kennedy being a young guy kind of represents the future of America in a lot of ways. Civil rights stalls until he sees the I Have a Dream speech in 63, but Kennedy's killed in 63. So in a lot of ways, the Civil Rights Act of 64 is passed as kind of honoring Kennedy to a certain degree as well. Urban renewal stalls with that as well. So poverty continues to increase. Education bills trying to do more things for schooling opportunities, all language. They don't really get much done on that. They do start pushing affirmative action, looking for equal opportunity for government contracts because they do have control. Despite all of these things that are kind of stymied and slowed down, Kennedy is still a pretty active president. It's the most legislation passed since FDR. One of the things he works on is the Area Redevelopment Act. This is looking at about $400 million to try to increase economic opportunity in urban and rural areas. Galbraith Rights of the Affluent Society, Harrington, Poverty in the United States. These are looking at the huge divide of the 1950s and early 60s with regards to poverty. You can see there up 25% of the nation is living in poverty. These books would have a very large impact on LBJ, the guy that's going to take over when Kennedy's assassinated, and what Johnson will call his war on poverty. Speaking of Johnson, we've got Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1963 to 1969. That's going to be his presidency. We call him a horse trader. That's a kind of a phrase. He's very good at making deals. Texas from inside Congress, wants to do what he did in Texas all across the country, and is a big New Dealer. Is very much in the same vein of FDR. Johnson is a huge FDR fan and will carry similar policies going forward. You can see LBJ on the left and LBJ on the right. So challenging LBJ in the 64 election. Remember, LBJ is going to serve out the remainder of Kennedy's year. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 63. The election will be in November of 64. LBJ runs as the Democrat. He will run against a guy named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater, you can see him in the top right, is a hardcore anti-communist, advocated the release of nukes in Vietnam, even if it came to that. Is anti-Civil Rights Act. He's not anti-civil rights, but he had supported all versions of civil rights up until this point. But he just believed that several articles of the Civil Rights Act of 64 got in the way of personal liberty, individual business ownership, things like that. Goldwater is very much a states' rights guy, and so he ended up being against the Civil Rights Act of 64. You can see his quote there, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Johnson will run a campaign ad, a commercial called the Daisy ad. If you YouTube it or Google it, what have you, you guys can watch it on your own time. But basically, it's a girl pulling off petals, counting down the number of petals, and then boom, it starts to count down and nukes. And basically, Johnson's saying Goldwater's crazy, and if you vote for him, the entire world will be nuked. And in part, that helps Johnson win a 61% of the vote in the election. Johnson is the last New Deal guy of the New Deal fair deals of Truman. After that, so the next Democrat will be Carter. Will not really be a New Deal type of thing. But Goldwater, even though he loses, he is the beginning of the modern conservative movement. The big that is the Republican Mount Rushmore guy, future president elected in 1980. George Wallace is a conservative guy as well, but he is a Southern segregationist. And so you do see kind of Goldwater is the genesis of this modern conservative movement, which comes to fruition with Reagan. But Johnson wins in the immediacy. Democrats will control Congress as well. And so the 60s will be a Democrat decade for sure. Here we can see the electoral map. You see the solid South actually got won by Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is from Arizona, so that's why he wins Arizona. So this is a huge flip. So 64, you would not really expect to see the deep southern states vote for the Republican Party. They have Reconstruction pretty much consistently. And so this is a huge change, in part because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64. Here's Johnson. Looks like he is sitting down having a conversation with some poor people. Johnson's programs will be called the Great Society and will focus, a huge facet of it will be on poverty. So LBJ, Great Society, declares war on poverty. This is one of America's long-running wars on nouns. You can decide how effective the wars on nouns are: war on drugs, war on poverty, war on terror. Johnson does pass Economic Opportunity Act, creates Office of Economic Opportunity, Job Corps, Head Start, family planning, food stamps. All of these things are meant, Vista, to help out urban poor, fix issues for them, rural poor as well. Community action programs, grassroots, starting from the people working up. Johnson will expand affirmative action to include race and sex now. And then the big programs that he does are Medicare and Medicaid. This is very much in the ideas of the New Deal. Universal health care has been a goal for Democrats forever, pretty much since the New Deal. Didn't really get it done. Truman couldn't really get it done. Johnson's able to, in part, get it done with Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health care for elderly. Medicaid is health care for the poor. The government foots a huge chunk of the bill, and the doctor, everybody else pays for the rest. So this is a major expansion of government's influence in people's lives, very similar to the New Deal. So if you're writing anything about the New Deal, you could conclude this type of stuff with Medicare, Medicaid, and then you go even further, and you could add in the 21st century President Obama's Affordable Health Care Act. There's a common thread through all of those of the government increasing control and influence of industry, specifically in this case, the health industry. So Johnson's war on poverty will also include creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, still around today, looking at doing education, using multiple languages to teach students in school, setting aside taxpayer revenue for the arts, humanities, public broadcasting, so Sesame Street, all that good stuff, gets funded by the government. Immigration Act gets rid of the quota systems. Hopefully you remember the quota systems. These were done in reaction to World War I at the conclusion in the 20s, all the quota acts, all of these things that put in place to greatly reduce immigration, specifically from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then all of the Civil Rights Acts get done under Johnson too. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, and then the Civil Rights Act of 68 are all signed by LBJ as well. So these next two slides we have seen before, but we'll revisit them. You can see on the graph here, blue is Northern Western Europe immigration, the yellowish, orangish, however you want to call it, color is Southern and Eastern Europe, and then you can see the effects of the immigration restriction. And then the McCarran-Walter Act 52 would be Cold War related. Here is just showing you spikes in immigration in thousands. So you see World War I kind of drastically reducing immigration, and then it peaks afterwards, post-war. Then you see the quotas applied there, and it displaced persons was after World War II. And we begin to revise this stuff through the 60s. And then the 90s, you can see the amnesty, late 80s, 90s, that'll be Reagan. So immigration, up, down, long trend in the history of the United States. So just like you had with the FDR and the New Deal, when you extend government power into things like Medicaid, Medicare, affirmative action programs, civil rights acts, all of these things, it's going to start another debate in the country about the size, scope, and role of government in daily life in American society. Affirmative action welfare programs will be the most contentious. Affirmative action because we're in the middle of the civil rights fights, and then the welfare stuff because that's basically being paid with taxpayer. You're redistributing wealth is going to be a driving force for that, so you're going to cause higher taxes. Medicare, Medicaid are incredibly costly programs as to the budget of the United States. And remember, Johnson's also fighting Vietnam at this time as well, and wars are very expensive too. So in a lot of ways, Johnson is fiscally burning the candle from both ends, and you can only do that for so long, and it'll have negative impacts going forward. He does have opponents. We talked about George Wallace representing that segregationist idea. Barry Goldwater is the foundation of the new conservative movement that Reagan ultimately is the capstone of. And then just like with the New Deal, you'll have liberals, you'll have Democrats who say it doesn't go far enough. FDR had Huey Long saying that there should have been greater wealth redistribution, and you have liberal critics for Johnson saying the Great Society doesn't go far enough, doesn't spend enough money and circulate that money around. That being said, the Great Society is the first large-scale investment domestic social program since the New Deal. Asking you, why didn't Truman, Eisenhower, or JFK do it? They were slightly busy with the Cold War, right? Ending World War II, fighting Korea, and then the expansion of Cold War ideology and fighting the expansion of the Soviets in the 50s and into the 60s, as well as like being able to build a consensus. Democrats were always hesitant to do this because you're going to run into trouble in the southern states, and that was proven correct when Barry Goldwater wins the Deep South in '64. So there's a lot of conflicting priorities in the early presidents with the civil rights movement, with Kennedy's assassination, with Bobby Kennedy's assassination, with Martin Luther King's assassination in '68, the last two. That is enough oomph to get a lot of this stuff done. In addition to just the large-scale civil rights movement has been pushing since the 50s. So that's how you're able to attack some of this. So here we see a chart, poverty percentage based on year. You can see that it bends down in the 60s from about 23, 22, 24, that kind of period. Gets as low as 12 and is kind of flat line, stays within 10 to 15 throughout the rest of the century. This is also a time of rebirth for the women's movement. The last time we really spoke about women's movement would have been pursuing the 19th Amendment. And then before that, right, we would have been talking with temperance movement, with the suffrage movement, things like that. So you do have a presidential commission on the status of women. This is first chaired by FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Looking at trying to close the wage gap. Betty Friedan, definitely a name worth knowing. The National Organization for Women, otherwise known as NOW. Friedan writes the book, The Feminine Mystique, which is looking at the impact of the 1950s expectations of housewife, child rearer, things like that, what that does on women. And then the 60s, women are enjoying more freedom, right? They're having fewer children. The birth control pill has been invented, so this is a huge component of a sexual revolution. Divorce rates are becoming more acceptable, and women are attaining higher levels of education. And then the Civil Rights Act of '64 and begins to make inclusions for anti-discrimination against women as well. So women's lives are improving in the sense that they're having greater access to choice in a variety of ways. On the other side of the argument is Phyllis Schlafly. She will oppose a lot of these rapid changes for women, arguing that traditional roles had great value. And what you're going to see here is that later on, when we have the debates over the Equal Rights Amendment, you're actually going to have women against women. Betty Friedan and her side will be for the Equal Rights Amendment. Phyllis and her side will be against it, saying that it threatens traditional roles of women. And liberal activism will actually weaken the New Deal coalition LBJ was trying to expand. Remember, the New Deal coalition was traditionally working class whites, inner city unions, all of that type of stuff. And as we give more and more people voices, more and more people freedom, it allows fracturing to occur within old coalitions, different country, different time, and we're actually moving to create a new party system around this time period as well. So here we have the early beginners of the National Organization for Women now. Switching gears to Vietnam, it will escalate and become an actual shooting big time conflict under LBJ. Eisenhower had advisors there. This harkens back to the domino theory. That's why we were there. Kennedy will increase the number of advisors there, and then Johnson will get the whole thing rolling. It really kind of begins with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in response to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water off the coast of Vietnam, and supposedly American warships came under fire by North Vietnamese patrol boats, and is used as the justification for increased American involvement in Vietnam. And so the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in essence, is a blank check for the president. It allows the president of the United States to take any and all necessary means to defend American interests in the region. And if you think that's very broadly worded, you would be correct. And so this will become the resolution that we fight Vietnam under. And it gives the president unparalleled power and control over the militarization of the war. So we call it the Americanization because at the end, Nixon's going to call it the Vietnamization as we try to get out. We start out with Operation Rolling Thunder. Great, cool sounding operation name for an air war. We're basically going to try to bomb Vietnam into submission. We do start racking up combat troops. 185,000 by 68, just 3 years later, there's over 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. And again, this is all ostensibly done to fight the expansion of from North Vietnam, backed by the Chinese and the Soviets. As we come to find out, by the end of everything, we realize that the government is really good at lying to the American people during Vietnam. Television plays a huge role in this as well. Every night they're going to be reporting on CBS, NBC, ABC, the number of Americans killed that day in Vietnam, number of Americans killed that week, how many Vietnamese have we killed. You'll have reporters with cameras being able to videotape combat operations, so you see the explosions, the wounded soldiers, dead soldiers, blood everywhere. It brings every horror of war into your living room every night. And the American people can only watch that for so long. You get a credibility gap beginning to develop here where the government keeps saying the war is almost over, the war is almost over, victory's right around the corner, we're going to win, they're going to give up any moment now, and yet they don't. And so you begin to see an anti-war movement begin early on when we're drafting people. If you were going to college, you had a exemption from the draft while you were at school. So then you need to think in the 60s, what socioeconomic class of people are going to college? And it's not going to be poor people. So this war early on gets fought largely by poor whites and minorities getting drafted. So you begin to see an anti-war movement with young people who are going to get drafted and forced to fight all the way around the world for a cause they may or may not believe in. And it just becomes very toxic. And you begin to see the protest movement ratchet up. It'll walk hand in hand with civil rights protests as well. Here we have it for you visual learners, U.S. troops in Vietnam. You can see it peaking north of 500,000 in the middle. So 67, 68, 69 are going to be the peak years for Vietnam. So the next couple of slides, we'll look at some images here. In the top left, you have aerial bombardment. That's actually white phosphorus that's being dropped. You can tell by the thin white contrails of smoke spitting out from there. This is incredibly incendiary devices. White phosphorus will actually burn under water. It brings its own oxidizer to the table. Bottom left, you see them burning a village. In the top right, or to the right, the photo is entitled Evacuation of Vietnamese Civilians in a Burning Village. This is a war for the quote-unquote hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And if you're wondering how do you win the hearts and minds of the people when you're burning their villages down, you have hit on a major problem with Vietnam. We are largely doing search and destroy missions where we go out into the jungle, walk around, look for bad guys to try to kill them. This war is not about taking territory. It's not about invading North Vietnam, toppling the government to keep South Vietnam from falling to communism. And as we'll find out after the war is over, we were going to fight as long as they wanted to fight. A lot of stuff gets declassified, gets published despite being classified, and we find out a lot of truths of Vietnam at the end. So you can imagine just the stress on the soldiers themselves. They're not much older than you guys, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, kind of that age, and you're thrown into a hot jungle. People don't speak English. It's a foreign culture. You don't want to be there. They don't want you there. The Viet Cong are basically civilian terrorist type forces, so there is no uniform that they wear. They're hard to determine who's who, and just very, very dangerous, this miserable warfare. Not that any war is good, but jungle warfare is exceedingly difficult on a major military. So you see some pictures depicting that there. Here are some other photos. Top left, you see him carrying a dead or wounded soldier. Top right, wounded soldiers there as well. And again, keep in mind, these images are being beamed into everybody's televisions while they're watching dinner at 5 or eating dinner and watching TV at 5 o'clock. Bottom left looks like a napalm strike. Napalm is an incendiary weapon. And then the right, you see the helicopter becomes a new weapon of war for Vietnam as well, choppering guys around the jungle, etc. And then you got guys coming back telling stories. They're like, hey, here's what we did, and we did terrible things over there. It's warfare, yada, yada, yada. It fuels the protest movement as well. That's not to say there aren't people who don't support the war. And there's plenty of soldiers who go over there and fight because they feel it's their duty to support and defend their country. And so you get a very conflicted side, very different from what we have today, where even in Iraq and Afghanistan, when those conflicts became unpopular, it was, I support the soldiers, but I disagree with their conflict, they're forced to fight. So you start nuancing your debates because Vietnam really shows the country, large segments of the country turning against their fighting forces. So who are the students that are resisting? Well, on what we call the New Left, it's a vocabulary word for the chapter, you've got Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, who outline their beliefs in the Port Huron Statement. These guys are inspired by the civil rights movement. They're going to fight poverty, consumerism. So you had the Beats of the 50s fighting consumerism. You got the students of the 60s fighting it as well. They're going to be against the war. Berkeley free speech movement originating at Berkeley's campus, protesting the war. Students openly resist their draft. The young people are the anti-war demonstrators. It is a younger person's protest, and they'll burn their draft cards. The government issued cards that give you your draft number and all that. They burn them in a form of protest. On the other side of the equation, you had groups like Young Americans for Freedom, who outline their beliefs in the Sharon Statement. These are the more conservative groups. For example, the YAF is a conservative group. They're going to support the government, support the war. And then you have another group, the counterculture, like the hippies. And why are they such a big deal? It's actually a small segment of the American population embraces like the hippie culture, but the colors, the drug use, the music, all of these things make for great scenes in movies and on posters and stuff like that. And so it kind of creates this mark on American society. But they were living like trying to do communal living. The whole idea of where like they live together, they share resources, private property isn't really a thing or anything like that. And there's a great quote from a guy that was a hippie. He said that we were all together on the peace and the love stuff, but where we fell apart was on who was going to do the dishes and who was going to pay the bills. But they are very, very like Woodstock again, and then the psychedelic drugs and the colors and stuff like that. So here we see anti-war protests. I always laugh at the image on the top because I doubt they had a .org website set up in the 1960s, but it does show some protest imagery. You get bottom left is a famous picture of a young man putting flowers inside the rifle barrels of the National Guard that gets called out. And the right, they had a huge protest in D.C. and Central Park in New York, and it says, "Get the helicopters out of Vietnam." So you see a lot of protest imagery during this time period as well. Yes, and then of course we have to have the counterculture, the hippie movement, the free individuals banging the bongos, playing the flutes, dancing around, just high on life is how we'll phrase it. Jumping back into the war, another major thing. Again, we're not really going to get involved in the Battle of Ia Drang or the demilitarized zone, A Shaw Valley, or anything like that. It's not the purpose of our course. But one of the few military engagements that we definitely need to do is the Tet Offensive. It's in January of '68. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, huge celebration culturally. And keep in mind, we've been telling everybody that we're getting ready to win the war. We're getting ready to win the war. And so there's usually a ceasefire during Tet that had been in place while the Americans were there. And this time, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong again are South Vietnamese citizens that are pro North Vietnam communist. They launched this massive surprise attack all across South Vietnam. Every major city is hit. Numerous military installations are hit across the entire country. The embassy, the American embassy in Saigon, is actually taken over by Viet Cong for several hours. This is widely televised. And what this shows is this is not the effort of an enemy that's getting ready to surrender, right? You launch this massive attack all across the country. You're not ready to give up. And so Tet and television combined creates this visual image that America is losing and the government is lying. What happens militarily speaking is that over the next month, the Tet Offensive is actually a disastrous military defeat for the Vietnamese. The Americans retake every installation. They retake the embassies. The Viet Cong cease to be a fighting force. We pretty much annihilate about 20,000 of them within a month in response to Tet. But the damage has been done because wars are won ultimately with political will. Political will stems from the approval of the American people, and then it's that will that puts the militaries on the ground, etc. So, like, public support drops. You can see it dips below 50%. So the majority of people after Tet Offensive are against Vietnam, and it will never get back to the positive. LBJ is viewed as weak on this, kind of inept, etc. Like Vietnam will undo his presidency. And then ultimately, as we'll see in another slide, he will not seek re-election in 1968. He doesn't run. 68 is one of the most individually contentious years of the 20th, 21st century for sure, if not the entirety of American history. You have massive anti-war protests in response to Tet. The Tet Offensive itself kind of kicks off 68 as a year of violence. The anti-war protests, and then you have Martin Luther King killed in Memphis on April 4th. The anniversary of that just recently passed. And then you have massive rioting in response to King being assassinated. And then just a couple of months later, in June, you have Bobby Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK, is assassinated in Los Angeles. And he was running for the Democrat nominee, and a lot of people believed he would have gotten it. Had he gotten the nominee, a lot of people believed he had a really good chance of. So you have Tet as one, the two assassinations as 2 and 3, and then the fourth one will be a massive riot at the Democrat convention later in the summer of '68. For those of 4 big crisis or examples of violence and contention in the 1968. So here we have a map that splits North and South Vietnam, as you can see. Thailand is allied with the United States. Laos and Cambodia are neutral, but you also notice the big red line going through Laos and Cambodia. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North. This is a major resupply trail for forces fighting in the South. And notice that it goes through those countries. We fight Vietnam in a very limited fashion. Officially, we fight South Vietnam. So the North Vietnamese know this, so they'll hit us, and then they'll oftentimes run into Laos and Cambodia, knowing we won't chase them. It's a very crazy way to try to fight a war. It's a very limited way of trying to fight a war, and puts your guys in a very big bind on the ground. So this is showing the Tet attacks. You can see they happen all across the country, all the way up from Quang Tri and Hue up in the north, right next to the demilitarized zone, all the way south. Into even south of Saigon, Bien Hoa, the Mekong Delta area in South Vietnam as well. So a huge offensive by the Vietnamese, but militarily unsuccessful, politically very successful. And they know this, and they know how they win. The Americans will never lose a battle in Vietnam, but we will ultimately lose the war. So here is the very tragic picture depicting Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. You can see them pointing to where they think the shots came from. Martin Luther King is laying on the ground, and he will ultimately die from his wounds. And in response to this, as we already mentioned, riots will break out across the entire country. Ironically enough, the one major city they don't break out in is the one where Bobby Kennedy speaks and mentions his brother, and that he very much knows what this feels like and calls for peace and calm and is able to persuade the crowds there to not turn to violence. And then he again will later be assassinated. Here is Robert Kennedy. You can see largely African American crowd that he is speaking and appearing before, and then he will be assassinated in June of 1968. And then here you have the 1968 Democratic National Conventions, where the Democrats are getting together to pick the guy that's going to run for the president. LBJ has said he's not going to seek re-election. He's going to try to focus on Vietnam. Now, LBJ creates a lot of his own problems for Vietnam. He's very famous as saying that the bomber pilots, and his quote was something to the effect of, "Those flyboys in Vietnam can't even bomb an outhouse without my say-so." So DC is very much, it's picking the target lists for the military to bomb. It's telling them tactically how to fight the war, which is usually not going to be successful long run for the military. You have huge protest demonstrations outside the convention. You can see the pictures at the bottom of the slide there. And it just creates this disconnect. Democrats on the inside talking about picking their guy and democracy, freedom, and equality. And then on the outside in Chicago, you have the cops just absolutely just beating the snot out of people. And they ended up nominating the current vice president, Humphrey, saying that they were going to stay the course. Spoiler alert, it's not going to work. Nixon's going to get elected overwhelmingly in 1968. Speaking of Nixon, he will focus on the middle class and Southern whites. Why Southern whites? Because they're frustrated over the civil rights stuff. That's what Nixon calls his Southern strategy. And basically, Nixon runs on, we're going to bring law and order back because of all the protests and the riots and everything going on. America's pretty tired of that. And what he refers to as the silent majority. And basically what he's arguing is the silent majority is your everyday average middle class American that puts the hard hat on, supports America, supports the military effort in Vietnam, and does not protest and does not say anything. They live their lives, they support their country, but they're relatively quiet, and they represent the majority of America. Those two things will be very effective for Nixon. George Wallace will run, so he'll split the Democrat vote to a certain degree. He runs on the American Independent Party, and basically he hopes to have a repeat of some past elections where no one gets a majority and it ends up going to the House of Representatives. Wallace is able to touch on the liberal elite attitude, right? So kind of what we would call like a coastal attitude today, West Coast, East Coast type stuff. Welfare, civil rights issues, law and order. He touches on some similar things that Nixon does. Wallace is most famous for standing on the steps of the University of Alabama saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever in response to Brown v. Board, and then getting shot and nearly dying as he runs. Racist, segregationist guy will peel away some Democrat votes. Nixon does win 68 is a closer election. His re-election in 72 blows the doors off his Democrat opponent. And the Democrat Party is fractured, right? That New Deal era is over with Nixon, and we have to realign into the kind of the more modern Democrat Party, more modern Republican Party as we transition from the late 60s into the early 70s. So here we have the electoral map. You can see the dark red, deep south going to Wallace, to be expected. Humphrey winning the Democrat states in blue, and then Nixon winning the Republican states in red. So 56% of the Electoral College vote and wins 43.2% of the popular vote to 42.6% for Humphrey. And you can see Wallace wins about 13% of the vote himself. Top left, Nixon, very iconic, right? The double peace sign. Nixon is known, former Eisenhower vice president, a lawyer for HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Cold War, as well as governor of California. It's Wallace in the top right, and then Humphrey in the middle right over there. So we touched on this in our civil rights chapter as well, but you do begin to see a movement for other African Americans, other minorities, right, pushing towards different versions of civil rights. Starts in civil rights, Vietnam protests as well, but you have the Chicano movements for the Hispanic individuals, Black Power we talked about with Stokely Carmichael and SNCC, and then the Black Panthers. Poor People's Campaign for Poverty. You see in the bottom right, that's Martin Luther King Jr. in the middle. Right? And you see if you look at the sign, it says, "Men are not enemies. If we kill men, with whom shall we live?" And then it's written down in another language as well. So appealing to larger masses. Muhammad Ali on the left, very, very famous boxer. And again, he will dodge the draft and end up serving prison and lose time from his career as well. So you see sisterhood becoming a thing now, women movements as well. We touched on this already with Betty Friedan, and now this will grow. One of the limitations, if you want to say that, of the African American civil rights movement is outside of Rosa Parks, you don't see a lot of female leadership participation. So you'll have a separate kind of African American women's civil rights to a certain degree as well. College educated women, middle class, again, very similar to the reform women of the past. Think back to say like Hull House or the temperance movement of the 19th century, right? This is where we start getting sexist male chauvinism become words. And what are the key goals? Okay, so they want to be paid equally. They're looking for child care, abortion rights, which become a thing in the 1970s with the very large landmark Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. And then again, even within the white-led movements, you still see women of color being kept on the fringe and on the periphery of that. So you have multiple layers to civil rights, stratified, not only class, a lot of other factors focus in there as well. And then again, sexual politics, reproductive rights, as well as increased awareness for sexual assaults and harassment. More and more universities begin accepting women. Title IX, ladies, if you play sports, Title IX is a huge thing for you. Basically, it says that universities cannot receive federal funding, which is a huge source of funding for many schools across the country, if you discriminate on the basis of sex. So how does this tie into the sports stuff? Is you have to have equal female teams. So if you have a men's basketball team, you have to have a women's basketball team, or a female equivalent sport as well, because women aren't playing football for the University of Texas, for example, but women's diving, soccer, all of these things become a thing because of Title IX. So associate in your heads with women equality, specifically with education, and we're saying Title IX is added to the Civil Rights Act, right? So it's an addition to the Civil Rights Act of '64. There'll also be a movement for civil rights for gay, lesbian individuals. You have the Stonewall Inn riots. You can see a picture of Stonewall Inn there. It's where cops showed up. For a long time in American history, being gay was illegal. The Psychiatrist Association considered it to be a mental disease for a long time. And so these individuals faced a large amount of persecution as well. And so you begin to see civil rights movements for that group of people into the 70s and 80s as well. You have Harvey Milk out in California, one of the first politicians. He will be assassinated in part because of that. And then President Obama actually will preserve the Stonewall Inn as a historic landmark. It's in New York City. And this kind of riot against police oppression kind of like puts this movement on the map. So Nixon is a little bit more like Ike, a little more moderate. Goldwater was pretty extreme. We talked about the silent majority already, and Nixon ultimately is going to end Vietnam. That was one of the promises. He's going to do it later, not in the first administration, but in the second. What's the process is called a Vietnamization. You are making the war Vietnam, okay? So Nixon's phrase to get us out of Vietnam is peace with honor. Basically, we're looking just to get out at this point. We're not going to do what it takes to win, even if we could define victory to begin with, and the South Vietnamese. Spoiler alert, it's not going to go very well for the South Vietnamese once the Americans leave. By 73, we only have 24,000 combat troops, again, down from a peak north of 500,000 in 68, 69. But Nixon will also expand the war. We actually finally invade Cambodia to go after supply bases, arguably from a military standpoint, the stuff we should have been doing since the very beginning. But then when people find out that Nixon is saying we're going to get out of the war, but then they find out he's fighting in Cambodia, right? You see another huge crop of anti-war protests go through colleges. Kent State, Jackson State are two tragedies that occur in this process. Kent State is the more famous one. Jackson State is at a historic black college where actually more students are shot and killed. But this is where you have National Guard soldiers walking into student protests. Students get into conflict with the National Guard soldiers, and the soldiers end up on the students, and they end up killing several students that had showed up to protest the expansion of the war. So here is Nixon doing the handshake line with politicians, get your picture taken, all of that good stuff. So this is the picture is titled a pro-war rally. And again, here, right, this would be representative of Nixon's silent majority. Again, note the skin color, note the gender, right, hard hats, middle-class workers. As you can see all the patriotism, the flags, the sign right there in the middle, the heroes are here. So this, again, this would be very much pro-Nixon, pro-Vietnam, silent majority type group. So here's Nixon pointing at a map, pointing at Cambodia specifically. On the bottom right, we're bringing tanks to the fight. Now, tanks aren't usually going to be very good at jungle warfare. But it's too little too late at this point. The will to fight is gone. I mean, keep in mind, we've been basically fighting. Major combat ops kind of begin around 65, 66 in Vietnam and go up to 72, 73. So before the war on terror, Vietnam was America's longest running war. It is now present day's second longest because the war on terror has been going on for, at this point, almost 19 and a half years. So longer than most of you guys have been alive. Here we have Kent State. You can see the soldiers are firing tear gas in the top left. In the bottom right, very iconic picture for the tragedy. You can see the outrage and the pain in the young woman's face with the student laying on the ground. It's been shot and killed. So again, it's highlighting how fractious this is, how contentious this time period is. Civil rights, the war, all of this stuff, young versus old, generational conflicts as well. It is a very kind of violent, tearing apart time for America, for sure. And then we're also going to see, like with the My Lai massacre, the terrible things of warfare come out. In response to Tet, an American unit rolled into a village. They said they were fired upon. Not a lot of evidence to support that. They fired on Vietnamese. They just straight murdered people, men, women, and children. It's a war crime. It's an atrocity. Fuels the anti-war movement when this becomes publicized. Damages our relationship with the Vietnamese, certainly, and speaks to the brutality of warfare in general, and that in warfare, oftentimes, the good guys are very, very hard to define. On the larger scale, right, because this is still in the middle of the Cold War, Nixon will pursue what's called a policy of détente, and we want to ease the tensions with the Soviets. We think that maybe we can exploit a friction between Russia and the Chinese. We'll isolate North Vietnam that way, call it triangular diplomacy. You see the triangle on the right, USSR, Soviet Union, PRC, People's Republic of China, and North Vietnam is North Vietnam. So again, détente will continue. Again, each other off the face of the map. We'll do the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks, where we actually agree with the Russians to stop building new nuclear weapons. We'll just roll with the ones we have because we have like 15,000. The Russians have about 15, 16, 17,000, which is more than enough to eradicate the entire global population multiple times. Nixon will go to China, and Nixon will actually normalize relationships with the Chinese as well, to the best that they can be normalized for the time period. And they're saying like only Nixon could go to China because he's got the skills and the attitude to pull that trip off. So you do begin to see, despite Vietnam being backed by the Chinese and the Soviets, and everybody knows they're doing it, and which is causing Americans to be killed, we are still able to work on the macro scale. And don't worry, we'll get the Russians back in Afghanistan in the 1980s, basically their Vietnam. So how do we finally end this conflict? I know some of you are probably thinking this presentation feels like about as long as Vietnam felt, but we are almost done. So we'll hit them at Easter and Christmas of '72. This is where we go downtown, as the aviators put it, where we actually put missions to bomb Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, which hadn't been done since the mid 60s, basically, because of the rules. North Vietnam will invade South Vietnam. That prompts the Easter bombings. And again, the whole idea is we want to bomb them to the negotiating table. Like, we will put so much tonnage of explosives on your country, and we will do it continuously until either one, we kill you, or you're like, you know what, this kind of is not a good thing to do, and we don't want to endure this anymore. And the Vietnamese are pretty skilled negotiators. They'll argue for several weeks about the shape of the negotiating table, for example, to stall the talks, drag out the war, because they are very well aware all of this is being reported back home, number of combat deaths, the protests, etc. And so they know that for every day they can drag the negotiations out becomes more favorable for them, because the Americans will become increasingly desperate to get out. So by '73, our combat troops are gone. Our POWs are returned, allegedly. There's still a number of individuals listed as missing in action from this conflict. We will bomb Cambodia secretly. So this is, again, the secret bombings. This gets Nixon in trouble. And this leads directly to what's called the War Powers Resolution, or the War Powers Act, which is still in place today. And it limits the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Right? They're trying to limit Nixon's ability to prosecute this war. And it basically says that it has a number of days to commit soldiers to harm's way without informing Congress. Then Congress has to be informed, and they have to vote on it, etc. It still allows for military engagement to take place without a declaration of war. If you've noticed, we haven't had a declaration of war since World War II, and nor have we had one leading up to 2020. So we definitely find ways to fight wars without having the declaration, in part because of the War Powers Act that is placed to limit Nixon. And then Saigon falls in '75. Nixon's out forward as president when that happens because of Watergate. But the war finally, the total war ends in '75 when North Vietnamese tanks roll into the parking lot of the American embassy in Saigon, which today is called Ho Chi Minh City. So if you want to call Vietnam 1960 to 1973, definitely could work. Military advisors were taking increasing military ops there, and then the combat troops are out in '73. 3.5 million men and women will serve there. Women, largely nurses, play a huge role in theater as well. 58,000 names are inscribed on a very beautiful memorial in D.C., denoting the number of soldiers who were killed and missing. Missing in action is also on the wall as well. If you ever get a chance to go, the diamond after the name means they were killed in action, and a cross means they're still listed as missing, if I'm not mistaken. 150,000 wounded. In 2009 dollars, you can see there it cost $686 billion, so $500 billion for the conflict. And then we struggle. America doesn't lose wars, right? Like, we won the Revolution, we won we win the Civil War technically, we win World War I, Spanish-American War, Mexican-American War, all these different conflicts. Korea we kind of tie, but it's not a loss. But then we get to Vietnam, and we didn't accomplish our objectives. And so what do we do? How do we face that? It's kind of symbolic of the limitations that are seen in the decade of the '70s. And then what's called like a Vietnam shadow, if you will, or a Vietnam hangover. We don't want any more Vietnams. We don't want to fight another Vietnam War again. And so we sit out some conflicts going forward. And that's a long shadow. It's cast all the way into basically Desert Storm in the early 1990s, the military op in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the Iraq region. Military leadership was fearful that that could turn into another Vietnam. And there are some similarities you can make, certainly with the current war on terror. So yeah, Vietnam, cast over the American thought process. Last couple of slides here, we'll compare and contrast the Warren Court with the court that comes after them, which is the Burger Court. It's called legislating from the bench, where basically, like, through your court decisions, you end up changing laws. Brown v. Board was the big one. Again, that ended segregation in schools. Map v. Ohio, you guys can read the list. I'm not going to read it to you, but the big ones definitely are Brown v. Board of Education, Miranda v. Arizona. This is your rights to when you're arrested, right to remain silent. Anything you say can't be used. That one. Tinker v. Des Moines is another big one for students, saying that students could protest. They do have limited protections of speech. They wanted to wear a black armband, protest in the war. So very an activist court, if you will, and very much on individual civil liberties. Map v. Ohio protects against illegal search and seizure, things like that. So you do see some additions to civil rights protections there. The Burger Court comes a little later, Warren Burger. So you have Earl Warren as Chief Justice, and then Warren Burger as the next one. And key rulings here, U.S. v. Nixon is a big one. That's the whole Watergate one. Roe v. Wade is another really big one for abortion rights, argued through rights to privacy, actually. And then the bottom one down there, Regents of the University of California v. Bakke. This limits affirmative action and highlights what's called reverse discrimination, basically saying if you don't take qualified white people in favor of less qualified African Americans, it's reverse discriminating against them, and yada, yada, yada. So very much civil rights extensions. Burger Court really is more looking at laws curtailing a lot of the liberal stuff that had happened in the 60s as they move into the 70s. And again, he's Chief Justice for a while through 1986. 72, spoiler alert, Nixon's going to get reelected. Democrats are in disarray. They don't have an answer for Nixon. The New Deal coalitions are failing to a certain degree. You got to bring in new groups. McGovern is the guy they're going to run. Nixon, silent majority, Southern strategy. Like is going to kind of like slow roll civil rights stuff, using the courts and everything to appease some Southern voters. Taps that silent majority again. You can see he wins 520 to 17 in the electoral college vote, 61% of the popular vote. But none of it's going to matter because he's going to get tagged in the next chapter with the Watergate scandal and will ultimately be forced to resign from office in shame. But ironically enough, he wins a crushing re-election in 1972. There is your map. You can see McGovern doesn't win all that much, basically Massachusetts. And then you have a libertarian candidate winning one electoral college vote. But Nixon overwhelmingly, 520 to 17, crushing victory, but he'll be out very, very soon. And this concludes the contentious decade of the 60s in Vietnam. It's a crazy time during this time period. A lot of violence, protests, but a lot of progress made in the teeth of that violence as well to kind of forge a more modern America, which is kind of the journey we're on in the second half of the 20th century. So tune in next time for the depressing decade of the 1970s, where it all comes crashing down, to include Watergate, the truths of Vietnam, and an economic slowdown, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. But on that happy note, you guys have a wonderful day. We'll be back soon, and we'll tackle the 1970s.